And I know folks are still rolling in. We are going to get started like right on time this morning because we have a lot to get through. Maureen's going to do a more formal introduction of Larry, but I wanted to welcome you all. Hopefully you're all in the right place. So we're at the Homeless Continuum of Care training for the month, and we're going to be focusing on workforce. And Maureen's going to do a more formal introduction, but we're going to have a 2-hour training. We're going to hold questions until the end, and you can also put them in the chat, but we will have time for questions at the end. We won't be taking them as we go. And I'm also going to be keeping everybody muted while we're going, just to minimize background noise. So if I mute you, I'm not trying to be rude. We're expecting about 200 people, which is amazing. So we have a really good turnout, and I think we have a lot of folks both from homeless services and from workforce that are here to hear all of this amazing wisdom. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Maureen. If you have questions about anything tech related, you can private message me, or we'll figure that out, but I'll be your tech guru. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Maureen.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome. It is so great to see a good group here. You're going to have a fantastic time and learn a lot. My name is Maureen Nelson. I am the administrator with the Workforce Development Board of Contra Costa County. I just want to say really quickly that this webinar is being paid for by the Workforce Accelerator Fund from the State Workforce Development Board. Yes. So we want to let you know how this webinar will work. I'm repeating some that Jamie just said, but to be sure that we don't miss any of your questions or comments, please put them in the chat. We invite you to share your best practices, just keep them brief. And to make sure that Larry gets through all of his content, he will not be responding during or after the webinar. About 15 minutes prior to the end, we will read what you have posted so Larry can respond, and we'll try to get to as many comments and questions as we can. We may not get to all of them. And now I will introduce the main event, Larry Robbin, our speaker. So Larry has over 45 years of experience in workforce development and is regarded as a national expert in the field. He has trained more than 100,000 people, spoken at more than 500 conferences, and presented more than 300 webinars. His services have been used by over 1,000 organizations, including America's Job Centers and other government agencies, nonprofits, schools, training providers, and businesses. He has helped design more than 150 programs and won more than 100 awards. So Larry's first experience with the population that we're focusing on today came as a child when he worked in his family's restaurant. The restaurant hired many people who were homeless, and he saw their strengths and struggles up close. Later, when he began to design programs to employ people experiencing homelessness, he would remember those early days. So the excellent outcomes of his programs resulted in the Department of Labor hiring Larry to be an evaluator. Soon he was training staff and providing management consulting. Larry has trained for Shelter Inc., JVS, Opportunity Junction, St. Vincent de Paul, Loaves and Fishes, Catholic Charities, Goodwill Industries, the Bread Project, Job Train, and many others. In addition, he has volunteered many hours, providing direct services for people who are homeless. As one observer noted, Larry's work is always grounded in a deep understanding of what people really need to be successful. Today, he will share with us a variety of strategies we can use to move our clients closer to success. And now I will turn the webinar over to Larry.
Thank you so much to both Maureen and Jamie, who've been great partners in putting this webinar together. I just want to give a particular shout out to Maureen. I've known Maureen since I think about 2008, when we were both teenagers. And Maureen was working in Goodwill in San Francisco at the time, and they did an experimental program, a diversion program, where people who'd been arrested for drug offenses could either go to jail or they could work with Maureen and get a job. And that program had such amazing outcomes, thanks to Maureen's creativity and hard work, that it became a national model, but it was the first one in the country. And you've gone on just to do that kind of work ever since. And Jamie and I met for the first time in the course of putting this webinar together. And I want to thank you for all the background information around the continuum of care and the population and the connection with the folks in your county that do the data gathering. They've been very helpful as well. So I do also want to thank all of you for doing this work. This work has never been more difficult, and yet it's never been more important. So the impact of this work is beyond getting people housing, beyond getting people jobs. It's literally saving lives. When you're working with people who are homeless, that is a life shortener to be true. And some of you have lived experience in this, and I want to give special recognition to all of you folks with lived experience who made this journey from being homeless into the workforce, in some cases back into the workforce, in other cases for the first time into the workforce. And I just want to echo what both Maureen and Jamie said. Please put any questions, comments, best practices in the chat function, and we'll have about 15 minutes at the end of the webinar to get to as many of those as we can. While homelessness is something that many Americans are learning about for the first time, the truth is America has a very, very long history with homelessness. The term homeless first appeared in print in 1640. In 1640 in Boston, some faith-based organizations were setting up almshouses for people who were very poor. And there was a newspaper article about this, and it mentioned the fact that some of these people were homeless. So well over 300 years of struggling with this issue. And we saw spikes in homelessness during the Revolutionary War, during the Civil War. War is a great generator of homelessness. And we also saw it obviously in the Depression of the 30s, and now we're seeing it again. There are about 700,000 people who are homeless in the United States, rough count. Currently, about 7,000 of them are in Contra Costa County. And I want to just share a quick story about my first interaction with people who were homeless. As Maureen mentioned, my family ran a restaurant. My dad and my grandfather were very progressive, and they only hired people with barriers to employment, including hiring people who were homeless. And one day, the dishwasher machine broke. And the dishwasher was working at the speed of light, but he could not keep up with the dishes that were coming into the kitchen. And it was the start of the lunch rush. And my dad was panicked. We ran a fairly lean restaurant. We didn't have a lot of people. And my family always, the back door to the kitchen opened up on an alley. And this was in downtown Chicago. And they always kept a pot of soup on the stove right near that door. And anybody who wanted soup could come, and they had these real tall paper cups, and they'd give them a paper cup and they'd be on their way. And this day, a guy who I had gotten to know, because I always tried to talk to these people and make them feel welcome, a guy, Alberto, came in the doorway, and I gave him this soup, and he said to my dad, who he knew, he said, "Mr. Robbin, what's with all the dishes? Is something wrong?" And my dad said, the machine is broke. I don't know what we're going to do. We're getting started for the lunch rush. We need every dish we've got. And at that point, Alberto stepped into the kitchen and he said, "I can help with this. I'll help with this." Now, it's illegal for employers to ask people to work for them for no pay. But when people offer, that's a little bit of a more gray area for people. And my dad was desperate. He said, "I don't have a job for you, but I'll give you some food if I can pay you in food." So Alberto was really, really good. And he didn't push the dishwasher out of the way. He said, "Tell me what to do that would be helpful." And they worked like a team, a well-oiled team. And by the end of, after the lunch rush, my dad said to Alberto, "Well, I guess I had a dishwasher opening and I didn't know it. If you want the job, show up tomorrow, you got the job." And I know quite a few people who are homeless who've actually gotten jobs in that way. So I kind of want to dedicate this to Alberto and to Cornell and to Gwen and to Jose, many of the people I've worked with who have been homeless over the years, who taught me a great deal. As a matter of fact, most of what's in this webinar comes from the experience of people who are homeless who found their way into employment. So let's go to the first slide, and let me just do some introductory comments. So this webinar is going to highlight some of the strategies needed to help people who are homeless get jobs. I notice I'm having trouble being highlighted. Jamie, I'm just seeing if I set it up side by side. Speaker. The phone icon's up. I don't know if there's anything you can do on your end.
I think I have you pinned.
Yeah, there we go. Nope, it went back to the icon.
I have you, I think people can do it individually. So I have you pinned on my screen. Your video is pinned on my screen. If you want to, you can pin Larry's picture if you want to do it that way.
Wait a second, I just got into, I'm launching the meeting now again. Sorry, folks. There we go. But I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do on my end to.
I don't think you need to do anything, but can you see your slides?
Okay, I can see the slide. I'm gonna go ahead. I don't want to spend more time in this. The needs of people who are homeless are very complex in terms of all the things that have to be in place for them to become successfully employed. There's not time in the webinar to cover everything. I'm going to cover what I think are the foundational aspects of this work and give you some resources toward the end where you can do a deeper dive into the topic. There are many different pathways to employment that people who are homeless take, and not every idea in this webinar will work for everyone. And we need to offer services that are as flexible and yet customized to the needs of each individual to give them what they need to become employed. And some of the best information about employment comes from people who were homeless and became employed. And I think we should become the ongoing students of people with lived experience to learn more about how they found their way into the labor market and use the information to share it with other people who are homeless so they can learn from that experience. Let's go to the next slide, and I want to talk about workforce programs and people who are homeless. Many people, when we talk about serving people who are homeless, think that they're not going to be able to do it, that it's just going to be too time consuming, that they don't have the resources. But the reality is that the workforce system has been serving people who are homeless for a very long time. It's just that we didn't know about it. And someone may have had a stable living situation when we started working with them, became homeless over time, and somebody may have also been homeless when you started working with you, but they didn't tell you. So I've talked to many different people who are homeless about this issue and said, you know, why didn't you, have you told your case manager, have you told your employment specialist, have you told the job developer? And what they say basically is that they're afraid of being treated differently. And I think that that is a reality. It's not something that they're just projecting. I think that that is a reality for some people. So they may also have felt ashamed about their status and not wanted to talk to you about it. Let's go to the next slide and look at some of the other people that are being served that we might not realize are homeless. So the well-dressed, dislocated white-collar manager who was in long-term deep denial about being unemployed and did not get the services after their layoff may be, in fact, now living in their car. In the last recession, in the early 2000s, the number of white-collar managers that became homeless skyrocketed in many parts of the country. When I worked with the Maureen County Coalition on Homelessness at that time, they were able to identify over 4,000 white-collar managers who were homeless in their county and not coming in to the homeless service system out of shame, out of feeling like they didn't need it, out of denial. And this is happening again now. Let's go to the next slide and take a look at another group. We may not have identified the middle-class woman who is a domestic violence survivor and is still working as someone that is living in a shelter because she left her living situation to get out of the violent relationship. Research estimates vary, but some reports state that over 30% of women who are homeless are homeless because of domestic violence. And I've met a lot of these women in my work and volunteer work in shelters and in various programs. Let's go to the next slide and look at another group that sometimes doesn't fit what we think about when we think about who is homeless. So the college student that we're serving could very well be homeless. A Temple University study, this was done before COVID, so we expect that the numbers would be significantly higher now. But even before COVID, they reported that 20% of community college students in California were homeless, with higher percentages in some areas. And we may not think that the person that talks so much about their family is homeless. About 33% of the homeless population is composed of families. The percentage in your county is about half that, but it's still significant. So the reality is the workforce system is already serving many people who are homeless. We don't always know it. The other thing about serving people who are homeless I want to go into on this next slide is that many of them are working in some way. So if we can go to the next slide, we'll take a look at people who are homeless and working. So there's a lot of definitions of work. People could be doing regular, full-time, part-time, temporary agency work, odd jobs, recycling, day labor, selling newspapers, seasonal work. Some people see panhandling as a form of working. The estimates of people that are working vary a great deal. Now, in your county, your continuum of care asked people if they were working. We don't have data beyond that, what category of work it was, what type of work it was. But 15% of the people said that were homeless said that they were working. So it's really important to respect this and think about this as we think about people who are homeless, because there becomes a tendency to think about them as being unemployable, when in fact, with the right support, the right guidance, and the right supportive services, many, many people could work. I've seen estimates from as low as 15% to as high as 40% when you include all these forms of working. And in the surveys of people who are homeless, besides getting housing, the second most important thing cited by a majority of people is the idea of getting a job. So people place a very high value on this. So obviously, when I say something like that, I'm not talking about everyone, but I'm talking about a majority of people want to work. And it's important that we keep this in mind as we're working with people. Now, I've worked a lot around the country with different programs and different coalitions working on the issue of homelessness. And I want to give you some ideas about some of what I've seen as some of the best practices that can move the needle on the issue of homelessness and employment. So if we can go to the next slide, I will outline some of the elements of successful employment services for people who are homeless. So if we go to the next slide, please. We go to the next slide. It's like we lost the slides.
Can you hear me, Larry?
I can hear you.
I'm having some tech issues on this end. My Zoom is frozen. I'm going to drop out and
Okay.
try and drop back in.
Okay, I'm gonna go ahead, and when you
Great.
come up, if we can be on slide number 8, that'll be great.
Great. Sorry about this.
So in the introduction, I've done over 300 webinars. The majority of the time, everything works great, and then sometimes the Zoom gods just don't cooperate. So we do the best that we can. So one of the things that I think is fundamental in understanding this is that, we'll go to slide number 8. There we go. That it takes a village to make this work. So the places where it's most effective is where a workforce program is part of a strong collaborative effort focused on improving employment outcomes for people who are homeless. So the collaborative includes organizations that provide workforce services, housing, drug and alcohol counseling, mental health services, food, interview clothing, education, healthcare, showers, vocational training. You see, there's a whole range of services we need to bring together to be able to make this effort successful. The collaborative can also include organizations that don't provide services directly, but that want to support this effort. This could be faith-based groups, civic groups, media, government agencies, business groups, labor unions, and individuals like people who are or were homeless, elected officials, employers, and people in the community that want to help in some way. So you see, this is a fairly complex puzzle, but spending the time to bringing these folks together can really make a difference. I did a very long-term project with the San Francisco Council on Homelessness, and we had the council itself was this type of collaborative effort with all these types of organizations. And it was amazing to watch the synergy and how things played out in terms of different forms of support. So for example, we had the media involved. We had some local TV shows. We had neighborhood newspapers involved. And when they started running articles and shows about employers that would talk about their successful experiences hiring people who were homeless, we had employers contacting the council wanting to know how they could be part of this effort. So this can be the real building block and foundation for this kind of work. Now, not every area will have all these types of services and groups, and it's important to do an assessment of what does exist so you can see what you have and build on that. And speaking of building on, if we can go to the next slide, you have a very good and broad continuum of care in your county. It doesn't have all of the elements on the previous page because it's focused on housing as opposed to employment, but I think you could find out that what is missing from what I'm talking about and add it to the continuum of care kind of foundational partnership village that you have going. So this effort will be most successful if it's supported by a strong collaborative of organizations and individuals. One of the things it can do is it can lead organizations banding together to influence policy, housing, and get more funding. So when you speak with the united voice, you can influence that. As a matter of fact, one of the things the San Francisco Council on Homelessness was able to do was able to get foundations for the first time to actually focus some of their grant giving on organizations that were serving people who were homeless. They had always served some organizations that did a little bit, but now we're talking about organizations that have made it their main mission. So this is extremely important step in making this work. Let's go to the next slide and take another look at another element of the foundation of success. So the program has hired people who are formerly homeless to work in the program. And the second sentence in this, I think is really important. Formerly homeless people can be found at all the levels of the organization. So there tends to be a glass ceiling in a lot of organizations where they'll hire people with lived experience, but they won't figure out and work with them to help them develop the skills and capabilities and other attributes they need to advance in the organization. So people with lived experience can make the services much more relevant and effective. They can educate staff that doesn't have that lived experience, and they also can serve as role models for the program participants who are currently homeless. Now, the next thing I'm going to talk about is learning about the reality of people who are homeless and how we can do this in a partnership with people who are homeless or formerly homeless. They have to kind of facilitate what I'm going to describe. And what can be helpful is we may bring some workforce staff, not a big bunch of people, but we may bring them in 2s or 3s into encampments, into shelters, into emergency transitional and supportive housing to meet people where they're at and to see where they're at. And people are often surprised to see a lot of what's going on in those places, the good, the bad, both sides of it. But it's important that workforce staff have some experience. And again, I want to emphasize this is led and guided by people who are homeless or formerly homeless. And can bring people in small groups to facilitate this conversation and this understanding and appreciation of all the things that people who are homeless bring to employment, as well as all the challenges they face in making that journey into the labor market. Let's go to the next slide, and I'll show you what I think is the seventh most important ingredient in this in the foundational aspect of this work. The employment counseling works from a trauma-informed, strength-based perspective that looks first for assets to employment. So it's not a barriers-first model. It's an assets-first model. Now, trauma is a very complicated issue. I know this personally because I'm a trauma survivor at different points in my life, very, very severe trauma that pushed me close to suicide at a couple points in my life from different things. And there is a difference between, can we go back, please? Thank you. There's a difference between being trauma aware. So my most popular webinar right now, besides this one, is my webinar on trauma. And I make people trauma aware. They will be better at working with people who are trauma survivors. But there's a difference between being trauma aware and trauma informed. Trauma informed means that you are working on trauma ongoing, guided by mental health practitioners who look at every aspect of your services, how intake is done, how assessment is done, how referrals are handled. So, and on an ongoing basis to look at it, to look for anything that could trigger microaggressions or trigger trauma. That's the difference between trauma aware and trauma informed. Trauma aware is an important point on the journey, but it is not the same thing as a program being trauma informed. The work is done from a diversity, equity, and inclusion perspective. Staff are culturally competent and know how to serve the diversity of the population of people who are homeless. Homelessness is not an equal opportunity phenomenon. We know that obviously people in poverty, since poverty is the leading cause of homelessness, we know that that is a huge population of people that are homeless. But we also know that people of color are disproportionately represented in the ranks of people who are homeless. So for example, in Contra Costa County, 4% of your county's residents are African American, but 37% of the people who are homeless are African American. We also know that LGBTQ, and particularly transgender individuals, are overrepresented in the ranks of people who are homeless. We know that immigrants and particularly refugees are overrepresented. We know that people who were foster youth, current foster youth and former foster youth, are also disproportionately represented. So it requires a very robust training program for staff to be culturally competent and know how to serve the diversity of the population of people who are homeless. And the program has plans, number 9 here, to support staff to reduce the risk of secondary trauma and burnout. The hidden barrier to employment in the homeless service system is the people who work in homeless services and get burnt out and then quit and go do something else. And that kind of disconnection for people who are homeless who are working with that person, that kind of staff turnover can cause them easily to disconnect with the program. It also is demoralizing to their coworkers. So the program has plans to help support staff and reduce the risk of secondary trauma and burnout, to reduce the level of turnover and to make sure that people are well taken care of so they can stay and do this work for as long as possible. And then the element here, number 10, is that the business community is deeply engaged with the effort to help people become employed. So they're not seen as an outsider. The more progressive parts of the business community are brought in to help with this work. So in Raleigh, North Carolina, for example, the Chamber of Commerce has an initiative where it recruits businesses and matches them with homeless service providers. we had a number of employers on the San Francisco Council on Homelessness, and they were able to recruit people out of their business associations that they belonged to. And that made it possible for us to reach out to an incredible amount of business. Now, when I say business associations, people jump to the Chamber of Commerce. While the Chamber was part of the council, we actually got more jobs for people from the neighborhood business associations. So the Market Street Business Association, the Richmond Neighborhood in San Francisco Business Association, they could see homelessness in their community affecting it in a way, and they wanted to do something about it. So the business community is not an afterthought. Similarly, that labor unions and apprenticeship programs are not considered as an afterthought, but are integral into the work. So these are all the elements of this village that can make this effort successful. Now, there are a number of models that can be used to serve people who are homeless, a number of employment models. I'm going to give you some now, and then I'm going to give you another one a little bit later on in the webinar. So if we can go to the next slide, I'd like to start on some of the models that are used. So these are transitional employment and work experience models. So programs using these models, typically, they vary a lot, but typically what they look at is they have paid time-limited positions in a for-profit business that is often run by a nonprofit. So CEO, the Center for Employment Opportunity, is a national program which focuses on people in reentry, but of course there's a huge overlap between people in reentry and people who are homeless. And on any given day, they have over 8,000 folks working on their crews doing landscaping, painting, environmental work, all that kind of thing. And then as people become job ready, they move them out and help them get better paying jobs than they were earning when they were in the transitional employment program. Other places use government funding or other funding to provide work experience, which is where somebody goes to work, but their paycheck actually comes from not the employer, but from another funding source. So that's a couple of the models that are used. Supported work started in the field of working with people with disabilities and employment about 30 years ago, roughly. And one of the defining features of supported work is the use of a job coach. And this has made a lot of inroads into homeless services, and the Chrysalis in Los Angeles, long-standing program that runs a temporary agency, uses this model. It involves a job coach going on the job with the person who is homeless and helping them learn how to do it. And as they learn how to do it, the job coach fades out and is on the job less and less, at which point the person is doing the job completely on their own. And this model has helped people with very significant barriers to employment become employed. And there's some very good work being done in this area as well, not only with people with disabilities, but with people who are homeless. So let's go to the next slide, and I want to show you another model. So this model is not widespread, but I put it here because I want it to be widespread. So these are entrepreneurial models. These are programs that help people who are homeless start their own businesses. And I was part of a program like this, the Homeless Employment Collaborative, about 30 years ago, funded by the Roberts Foundation. And that foundation has now morphed into an organization called REDF, the Roberts Economic Development Fund, which is the leading, one of the leading funders and think tanks around what's called social enterprises and transitional employment. So if you're interested in that model, you can Google REDF and learn more about it. So we put together a wraparound kind of service model for people who were homeless who wanted to start their own businesses. And we provided them with coaches and mentors, got them access to some startup funding, ran classes for them on customer service and negotiating contracts and all this kind of stuff. And when the program completed, there was a post-completion evaluation that was done about 3 years after the program. And the amount of businesses that had survived from our initial cohort that we did was 3 times the amount of businesses that typically survive. So there are a lot of small business people coming into the homeless population now, and a lot of people who are homeless themselves that run the equivalent of small businesses just in the way they conduct their daily business. There was a person who was homeless in my neighborhood in Oakland named Michael. And Michael and my wife and I got to be friends, and we got to know each other very well. And I asked Michael one day, I said, I want to pay you to teach me something. He said, what can I teach you? I said, I want to spend a day with you saying how you earn money and how you go about doing all these things that you do. I was worn out halfway through the day. I couldn't keep up with this guy. All the different things that he had figured out. He was running about 4 micro enterprises, doing different things all over the place. So we should not rule out the idea of one employment option is helping somebody get the right resources to help them become self-employed or start their own business. Let's go to the last model I'm going to show you in this part, although I will revisit the models a little bit later. And these are career pathway, apprenticeship, and training models. Now, these services help people get into high-paying, high-growth jobs and training and education that can be the gateway to career pathways. They are career pathway programs. Some individuals who are homeless, this is a perfect match for who they are, what they want. Other folks may not be at a place where they can get into something like this. These programs typically are fairly rigorous and demanding. So people may need some housing stability and enough support to be successful. I'm certainly not saying don't make this as part of the menu that you offer to people, because one of the things about these, as opposed to many other ways that people are finding work, is that these types of programs, career pathways, apprenticeship, and training models, take people out of being the working poor. Whereas most entry-level jobs, they will still be the working poor, even if they're working 2, 3, or 4 jobs. So we have to think about this as an option for people, but we also have to meet people where they're at and help them figure out what services make the most sense for them. Now, I've done a lot of focus groups and a lot of talking to people who are homeless about what they do and don't like about the way they're served in homeless employment programs. And I want to share that with you now. If we can go to the next slide, please. So here's what they do and don't like. They do like staff that are respectful, friendly, engaging, and want to help. They don't like when it feels like staff doesn't want me to be there. And people who are homeless have a kind of radar. They have to have it. It's a survival skill of trying to figure out how people are going to treat them. And they pick up on it very early in the process. They do like that the staff help me believe that I could get a job. They don't like it when staff talk more about my problems than my strengths. That's that barriers first mentality that's so prevalent in workforce development, as opposed to the strengths first approach. They do like staff understood the impact of being homeless. They don't like it when staff are clueless about what being homeless means. So it's like, no, this is ridiculous. You don't have a clue about this. And there's some programs that use a lot of volunteers, which is really a good thing. If the volunteers come from middle-class backgrounds, they need a very strong orientation and kind of as part of that diversity, equity, and inclusion work to understand who it is they're serving. They have to learn how to become the students of people who are homeless before they can become the teachers. They like staff that are knowledgeable about resources in the community. They don't like staff that either didn't know about the resources or their information was not accurate or out of date. They do like staff that said that what they would do in a timely fashion. They don't like staff that promise things that they did not deliver. So it's very important to use peer interviews, peer-led focus groups, maybe surveys on an ongoing basis to find out what people who are being homeless think about the services they're receiving, so we can learn how to serve them better. This comes from human-centered design. So these programs should be driven to a large part by the perspectives and voices of people who are homeless. Now, a big question for you as you get into this work is on the next slide. If we can go to the next slide, please. So the big question is, what parts of the population of people who are homeless will you be serving? So the population of people who are homeless are very diverse. You can be long-term homeless, people who have been homeless 10 years or more. It can be short-term homeless. It can include dislocated workers. Veterans are disproportionately represented in the ranks of the homeless population. People in reentry, families, people with disabilities, seniors, youth, LGBTQ individuals, survivors of domestic violence and sex trafficking, immigrants and refugees. And this is just a few of the populations you'll find within the broad general population of people who are homeless. And the decision about who you serve will have an impact on how you recruit or how people are referred to your program. It will influence what kind of supportive services you need. It will shape the kind of services you offer. It'll even influence who you hire and many, many other aspects of your program. So you need to develop a focus on who you're going to serve. I haven't seen, and I'm sure it exists, there's lots of programs that I'm not familiar with, but the program can equally serve everyone that's in the homeless population. The needs are, there's a general part of the need, but then there's also very specific population-specific part of the need as well. So some organizations develop this in focus in conversations with organizations that are already providing some kind of services to people who are homeless. And your focus may change over time. You may decide, you know, we've done everything we could, but this part of the population just not working for us. Maybe we help another program that's providing some other service become an employment program, and along with those other services, and that will help these people with employment. So you need to make a strategic decision about who you will serve. The other strategic decision you're going to need to make is on this next slide. We can go to the next slide, please. I don't know if we have a screen freeze problem here or not, but the next slide, we can get to it, is about where you serve, but it's also a question of where the services will take place. Now, we're working in your county. I would say we, you folks are really working in your county. We're on slide 17, Jamie. Looking to create a very tight relationship between housing and workforce development. And one of the ways people have done that is that they embed and co-locate some services, some workforce services within a shelter or housing so that people experience it right where they are. And this improves communication between the staff of the workforce and the housing program. So in housing that was started by the Community Housing Partnership in San Francisco, one of the things we did in some of their housing was we had career clubs that took place in the housing, in the supported housing environment. So we had a career club for people interested in hospitality. We had a career club for people interested in construction. We had a career club for people who were interested in manufacturing. And we would bring in employers to talk about this work. We would bring in people who worked in the industries. And you could go to any career club you wanted, but it was a great way to embed that employment thinking inside the housing. What we want to do in this work is we want to vocationalize our thinking. And by vocationalize our thinking, what I mean to say is that regardless of what you do, And I'll give you some strategies for this a little bit later on in the webinar. But regardless of whether your job is a case manager, a housing navigator, to do outreach, or to do shelter staff, whatever your job is, that you look for employability and you look for what people tell you and what they've done, and kind of use it to help start that process of people thinking of themselves as more and more employable. So some programs will offer services like a job club in a shelter. Some programs will start services in encampments. I've done a job search workshop in a couple of encampments. Library, community center. Lost my slides. I don't know if anybody else lost slides or not. There we go.
Are there,
connecting me.
you're able to see?
That's
Sorry,
okay.
I'm having glitches on my end.
That's okay.
You can see.
Yeah, okay, no problem. So some places are using mobile vans to bring the services to people. Phoenix has an interesting program. I don't know if it was running a couple of years ago. I don't know if it's still running, where they use city-run vans to pick people up who wanted day labor jobs working for the city at city wages. And I know that they're talking about this in the possibility of doing this in Riverside County as well. So using the mobile van, kind of the workforce version of the bookmobile. So I'm going to pause here for a minute, because in a minute we're going to be going into some breakout rooms where, and let me talk a little bit about how that's going to work. We'll be in the breakout rooms for about 10 minutes or so, and 10, 11 minutes. And this is what I'd like you to do when you get in the breakout room. Please introduce yourself by your name. What is your job title? What is your program? And where is it located? Okay, so your name, your job title, your organization, and where you work out of. And then what I'd like each person to do right after they do that is to say something you do in the way that you're working now. And this is true whether you do any of these types of jobs. It doesn't have to be workforce. Is there something that you do that contributes to people thinking about employment, their belief in themselves that they can become employed? So after you introduce yourself, think about what it is you do. And if there isn't something you're doing, what could you do in the course of that would help just kind of spark a little conversation around that for people who are homeless. So let's go into the breakout rooms. You'll see my name and phone number, but I'm not going to participate in the breakout rooms. These are for you folks, okay? So can we go into the breakout rooms?
Yep, so I've open room, so you should have an opportunity. It should ask you if you want to join. And I'm actually going to pause recording right now.
And a big thing it shows the employer is you want to work for me. So employers don't want to hire people who want a job, because a person who just wants a job is a retention risk. You want to hire someone who really wants to work for you. And that is demonstrated by the person coming back on a regular basis to that particular employer. So you can also integrate career planning and conversations about career pathways into this. So it may not be that they hit every business that's located in that shopping center or on that business street. Maybe they prioritize which ones, leave some others out of the equation. And that can kind of give you an idea of deeper interests that people might have. Michael was incredibly successful at this, at doing this. And Michael's challenge, like with many people who are homeless, was more on the job retention side of things than on the getting the job thing. But he could do this. And he would have these walking routes in several places in Oakland that he would go on, and he would be able to get jobs by kind of his polite persistence at being able to engage the employers. Let's look at the next slide and look at another strategy that people use. To create a job strategy. Yeah, we want to go to the next slide, please. With this strategy, the individual does some form of work for a business without asking for money. So that's the example of Alberto in our restaurant. They might clean the sidewalk. They might help customers load things into their cars. They might wash windows. They find ways to show employers how they would work if they were hired. And this shows the employer the traits of a good employee. And people can also figure out some kind of need, and they could fill and show the employer how creating a job for them would be good for the business. It's not always responding to the job opening. Sometimes there's a way to help people that that businesses never thought of. A coffee shop opened up not too far from me, and there's very, very limited parking on the street of that, where that coffee shop is. And one of the people that was in one of the programs that I work with noticed that they weren't getting very much business and they were really struggling. And this is a person who was homeless, figured out, it's because of the parking situation. And so they went to the manager of the store and said, I think your business could do a lot better if you hired me to do curbside delivery to people. They could call in advance. You could have a credit card on file, and I could pick up their order. It's kind of like a DoorDash, but it's only like 30 feet. Well, that was a lifesaver for that business, and that person was hired, and a job was created for them. Now, this strategy can lead to businesses hiring people. It can also lead to people being ripped off and the employer getting free work. And I understand that risk, but it's something to think about when people are looking for creative ways to become employed. Let's look at the next strategy. And the next slide, please. So doing things to increase social capital. So social capital in job search refers to making connections with people that can introduce the job seeker to employers. So these referrals to employers are the hidden job market, where the vast majority of hiring takes place. Majority of jobs are filled in the hidden job market, even with things like LinkedIn and Indeed and all the online stuff. Employers will still go to people they know and trust. That could be employees, it could be friends, it could be contacts in the community, that they will go to them and say, I'm going to hire somebody to do this. Do you know anybody? So people who are homeless have done a lot of different things to increase their social capital. They volunteered at a food bank or a nonprofit, getting into a support group, like a peer support group, getting involved with a faith-based organization, getting on a sports team. Sports teams are oozing with social capital connections, not only the people on the team you're on, but also all the teams you play. Taking a free class, taking their dogs to the dog park and talking with people there. So people also ask people they know who are working to introduce them to employers. And they've also gone back to businesses they worked at before they were homeless to see if they can get rehired. So anything that increases social capital increases employability and shortens the distance between the person who is homeless and the job. I had a great example of this many years ago. I was doing some volunteer work, and I was working with this guy who was living out of his car at the time. And I asked him, do you have any hobbies? And I knew that, what kind of hobbies you get? But he said no. And then I said, my follow-up question always is, did you have any hobbies when you were younger? And his eyes lightened up, and he said, oh yeah, I was into model trains. I loved model trains. And then his affect changed completely, and he started talking, and I was into model trains. So we both had this model train kind of meeting, and it was just so much energy coming out of this guy. I couldn't believe it. And then I said, well, what about doing some volunteer work where you might be able to work with model trains? He said, oh, I don't think there's anything like that. I got on the internet, and that's where I found the Golden Gate Model Train Society in Point Richmond. And they accepted volunteers every day of the week in the evenings when they worked on the layout. So my guy gets his car, keeps it going enough to be able to get there. He's working on track. He's working on the trees and all this stuff. And he's working with a guy. They assigned him to a guy to work with. And in the second week, the guy who my guy is working with says, so what kind of work do you do? And my guy says, well, I'm not working right now, but I did work in construction, and I'm looking for work in construction. And then the guy from the Model Railroad Society says, oh, you're in luck. my brother's a contractor and he just got a huge contract. He doesn't know how he's going to be able to do it. And he's looking for people to hire. I'll refer you to him and I'm sure you'll get a job. And then my guy says, well, before you do that, there's some things about me you don't know that I want your brother should know these things and you should know them too. Number one, I'm homeless. And number two, I did 15 years in prison for dealing drugs. And then the guy from the Maureen Railroad Society says, my brother's been homeless and he did 20 years for dealing drugs. You guys will be best friends before too long. This is going to be wonderful. Immediately led to a job through a social capital connection. So let me give you an idea as you're working with people, what you can do to help increase the sense of employability in the individual. If we can go to the next slide, let me give you some ideas about that. Make sure you smile. Go out of your way to smile. Make the person feel comfortable and respected. Your first goal in working with someone who is homeless should, besides establishing a strong positive rapport with them, should be to ask yourself, what types of work can I imagine that this person could do? So you look at the clues in how they look, their personality, what they say, their life history, their interests. What would be helpful in a certain line of work? And you imagine a picture frame around this individual, and they're in the picture frame, and the picture is of them working. So what we're doing is we're looking for employability instead of looking for barriers. We are picturing them in the world of work. This can transform how you work with people, how you think about them, and ultimately how they think about themselves. So think about employability. Let's go to the next slide. Paint a portrait in your mind of each individual in the world of work. This portrait will evolve and change as you learn more about them. As you work with people, there'll be a number of portraits. As you describe the portraits of the person, it will plant the seeds of success in the world of work in this individual's mind. And these seeds can grow and can become a driving force that can lead to employment and career success. So we're kind of like planting a garden of employability in the mind of that individual. That's one of the most important things that you can do. Remember, some of the psychological effects of being homeless are feeling undervalued, feeling a lack of respect. And again, not every person who's homeless feels this, but many of the people that I've worked with have felt this way about themselves. And they've internalized the oppression they feel as they receive as people who are homeless. And then it starts to become the narrative that they tell themselves about themselves. So the more you can help them start to see themselves in the world of work, the more it can start to contribute to that motivation to going to work and enhance that sense of employability, which is such an important part, critical part of this process. So let's go to the next slide and look at this assets to employment approach, how you can work it. So as soon as you have enough information to see them working in the portrait, and when it seems appropriate, say something like, you know, based on what you're telling me, I could see you working as a, and then ask them questions as if they were working. What part of that job do you think you would like the most? Talk with people as if they are employed, not people who are homeless. Talk to them as if they are working. As you saw these things coming together and you painted that job. I remember working with Maria, who's an amazing human being. And when I asked Maria, what kind of things do you like doing? What popped up immediately was she said she loves cooking, but now she's living out of her car and she just had a Coleman camp stove in her trunk, and she would flip up her trunk and she would cook some things there. And she said, yeah, but you know, nobody would hire you. You don't have an address. You don't have this, you don't have that. And just this whole litany of things about why people wouldn't hire her. And then I said, so tell me about the food that you make. And she said, oh, I make enchiladas, I make chile relleno, I make tostadas. I said, you do that, all that on a 1-burner Coleman stove? She said, yeah, I learned how to do it, pretty good. I said, so are you looking for a job where you would be doing cooking? And she said, I can't cook. I can't work. I'm just too messed up. And then I said, well, let's imagine that I see you working at a Mexican restaurant, Jalisco, in the Fruitvale in Oakland. And now that you're working in this restaurant, what part of that job would you like the most? And then she just went on. She just saw it. And so, the create the job strategy that I mentioned to her. Well, one of the things that you can, I encourage her to do, excuse me, was to make a bunch of burritos and just start going down some of the restaurants that were in the Fruitvale area in Oakland and finding a manager and giving them the burrito to the manager. And she gave me some food that was fabulous food, some of the best chili relleno I've ever had in my life. Well, she goes to do this, right? She gets to the 5th restaurant. She gives the guy the burrito. She just stands there for a little bit. He bites into the burrito and he said, this is really good. I don't have any job openings, but what if you started out like at 3 hours a week during the lunch rush? And that's how it started. And it started with her believing in herself and in her employability. Let's go to the next slide. And I want to give you kind of a caution about how to work with people so that it can be most effective. Sometimes we think that the big picture, logical conversation, oh, you do this well, you do this well, you do this well, and then, what about doing this? And moving people on in those conversations, those big conversations. And big picture conversations may work very well with some people, but they can also have the opposite effect. When I was at the height of my trauma, dealing with my trauma, I could not focus enough to have those big picture conversations, and I would not want to get into them. And so it can actually trigger resistance and confusion in an individual if it's too much information for the individual to handle at one time. For some people like me, trauma will limit how much information they can handle. And this can definitely be true for not all, but many people who are homeless. So what works better than that big picture conversation? Let's go to the next slide and take a look. And go to the next slide. I'm going to go ahead just to stay on track, and hopefully we'll get to slide number 28 in a second. What often works better than that big picture conversation